Good evening, everybody. My name is Daniel Ross. I'm a visiting assistant professor of social entrepreneurship here at Hampshire College. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce our guest author and social entrepreneur, Khary Lazzare-White. I'll do a real brief introduction because I've known Khary for a long time. We grew up together. And Khary is going to come off as a very kind of laid-back guy. That's kind of how he appears now. But he's one of the more intense people I've ever known. As I said, I've known Khary since he was a little kid. And even as a little kid, Khary had an acute awareness of social justice and inequities and just what wasn't right in the environment around him. It's kind of a bit part of family legend that Khary, walking around the streets of New York City, maybe even as a 4 or 5-year-old, would see homeless people. And for many people growing up in New York City, homeless people become kind of part of the landscape, part of the background. But Khary saw, and right away would ask, who are they? Why are they out here? What's going on with them? Why don't they have homes? Why don't they have a place to live? And Khary not only would see and seek to understand and apply an analysis even as a young kid, but was compelled to do something. Even as a young kid, and made it his parents buy blankets and go with them to bring blankets to homeless people. And as an undergraduate, caring deeply about these issues for young black people of color, mostly men at that point, founded the organization, worked with a classmate to co-found the organization Brotherhood Sister Soul, which has grown to become one of the leading youth development organizations in the country, providing support for thousands of young people every year, and has become a model, an example with a curriculum developed to teach educators around the country and around the world about how to work with young people. Because of that intensity, Khary has had that intensity within himself, and on the kind of as an influence on the environment around him, but has had his means of escape. I don't know how many of you know that Black Panther, before it was a movie, was a comic book. And Khary was one of the first people I knew who read the comic book Black Panther. We read together, what was it, Iron Fist and, no.
Power Man and Iron Fist.
Power Man and Iron Fist, which was about a skinny little white guy who knew karate, and a bigger black guy who was really strong. And that was us. It worked. And we read a lot of fantasy books, stories of kind of heroism and magic that really spoke to Khary and allowed him to kind of, I think, see the world. And that still, Khary has that intensity, but also that sense of magic. It's not just like a happy-go-lucky magic, but a gritty magic that is part of what's real in the world around us and makes incredible things possible. And those elements are really reflected in this book passages. So let's welcome Khary to Hampshire College. Time for Khary to read for some of this book, and then time for some questions and discussion. Thank you.
So good evening, everybody. I will try to project so that everybody can hear in all corners of the room. And I want to thank Daniel very much for that introduction. I've been fortunate to do a lot of events since the book came out in September. But certainly that intro was very touching to hear from a friend of many years. And I'm glad his stories didn't go too far afield and start to get into all the childhood stories. I'll always appreciate that, Dan. So as Dan said, this evening I'm going to talk a little bit about Passage and the journey of the novel, read from it, and then have some time for conversation. I always feel it's better, as I said in one of the classes I was in earlier today, to have conversation with people. And so I do want to read, but I'd really love to be in conversation with the room. As Daniel said, I've been engaged in social justice work since 1995, building an organization called the Brotherhood Sister Soul, which provides comprehensive support to young people in New York City, trains people on our model across the country, and works on social justice policies that include criminal justice reform, transforming how policing is done in New York City, shutting down Rikers Island, and other issues. All of that work is very close to my heart, but before that work ever began, identified as an artist, as a writer. I've written since I was a little child. And so this was a very personal experience for me to write this novel. It's meant a lot to me to have it out in the world and to be able to share the story. It's the story of a young man named Warrior. It's not his given name, but it's what his name means in Akan, and he says at one point in the book that he doesn't yet feel ready to take on his actual name. He takes on the meaning of his name, and he appreciates that because every time he meets somebody, they know with whom and with what they are dealing, a warrior. He is based in great family love, and I think it's important to underline that often in the kind of communities that I work in the community that this book is about, that all too often when you hear about the lives of black children in working class, economically distressed communities, it's often painted in a space of degradation, of deficit. And that so often is not the case. That even if there's deficit in the community due to economic reasons or poor schooling, that so many young people come from wonderful, strong families and working class and blue collar families that support them. And the other stories are important. Last year there was a beautiful, beautiful movie out, Moonlight, which I loved. But all too often the stories of black working class life are the drug addicted mother, the drug dealing father. And that's a part of the lifestyle, but it's certainly not the dominant narrative. And so it was very important to me in my novel that Warrior be based in a family of love. He has deep love from his mother and his father. His mother lives in Harlem, his father lives in Brooklyn. Anybody who knows New York City knows it's like two worlds apart. Could be over an hour on the train. And so he moves in between those two households. And while his parents are separated, they love each other. They raise their children in a communal way. They just couldn't figure out their relationship. And I think that also is something that we often see. And so it's really important to me that he's based in that love, that he loves his sister. He has close friends. One is his best friend, Brother Man, and I'll read from a passage connected to him. And Brother Man is incarcerated. He has a best friend who's a woman who he sees every day in high school. He's not sure exactly what their relationship is, but she means the most to him and he to her. And so it was central to the story that he be based in that love. But every day that he leaves his home and the door closes, he walks out into a community that's rife with violence. He attends a substandard school. There are oppressive forces that seek his end. An essential aspect of the novel is what voices will he listen to? The families of love and history that he's surrounded by every day inside the confines and the safety of his homes? Or will he be influenced by the negative forces that he faces every day that he walks outside of his house? And so one of the most affecting comments I received at one of the readings I did was somebody saying how they were in terror as soon as he left his house and exhaled when he came home. And I wanted to portray the feeling that so many parents feel when their children leave the home, and certainly in tough urban areas, and certainly the parents of black and brown children, that they wonder if they will come home. There's a lot of talk about, obviously, the policing in our communities, and there's that fear. And I remember my father telling me as a child, you make sure you survive the encounter, and then we'll take care of them. But his fear was whether I would come home from those realities. And so that fear, and then the fear often of your peers, that as violent as black and brown urban communities can be, the victims of that violence is black and brown young people. So the perpetrator is black and brown hands, and the victim is black and brown hands. And so I wanted a novel that was essentially in communication with itself, talking about those two different specters of violence and of love. As Daniel mentioned, my kind of love of magic. There's an aspect of the novel that's also really about magical realism, some have termed it. I really think of it as the oral tradition, the very unique experience, the African-American oral tradition that was created as a way to pass on stories and history because it was illegal to teach black people to read and write for 13 generations in this country. And people forget that often, and so instead history was passed on through the oral tradition and storytelling. But if you imagine surviving in a country where all the founding fathers owned black people, enslaved black people, sold their own children, in the case of Thomas Jefferson, as we talked about earlier in the class today, then you almost have to have a magical approach to this country to imagine a different way, to imagine freedom in this country when the history has been such the opposite, to me is a form of magical realism, to imagine the America that America can be as opposed to the reality of what America's been. And so those are also themes in the novel. And so there's kind of the mythical hero's journey. There are aspects that are the parable. So when he walks out of his home, Warrior's not confronted by two drug dealers, but he's confronted by the specter of violence. That feeling when you turn a corner that violence may be around the corner, that certainly women of all colors and backgrounds feel walking down the street, the potential violence that's perpetrated on women for no other reason that they're women, and that feeling of violence that so often black and brown young people face and fear walking around in tough urban areas in this country. So there are aspects that are an allegory, but it's certainly very much based in reality. There are aspects of the story that very much are connected to me, and I see a lot of myself in the character and the character in me, but then there is a lot that is imagined as well. It is a novel after all, so you're protected by it being a novel and imagining what is fiction and what is art and what isn't. Last point I wanted to make before I read from a section is that, I think all too often young people are the least heard from, most discussed constituency in this country. Again, we were talking in a class earlier today about the fact that young people have been at the forefront of every social change movement in this country. The effort to create freedom for black people through the civil rights movement, through the women's movement, the anti-war in Vietnam movement, bringing down a president, the gay and lesbian movement for equality and freedom. It's been young people at the forefront. And all too often we don't hear from young people. And so I also wanted to bring the reader immediately into the psyche, the internal journey of this young man, and pushed back when some said this was a YA book. There's nothing wrong with being young adult. I want everybody to read it, hopefully, everybody. And it's fine for young adults to read it. But why is an adult protagonist readable by a teenager or somebody in their early 20s, but a 17-year-old protagonist is theoretically not readable for an adult? And so I also rejected that kind of marketing of the book and luckily found a publisher who was very much behind it. It's published by Seven Stories Press, and they publish folks from, Octavia Butler to Noam Chomsky, from Angela Davis to others. And so it's also wonderful to be in that kind of family of really political writers. That's what they focus on. So the segment that I want to read, and then we can talk some, introduces you to a few characters and also to the school where Warrior attends. I work in education. There are a lot of wonderful schools and wonderful teachers. It's why I do the work I do, but all too many of our schools are poor in terms of what they produce for our young people and educational opportunity. And so I also wanted to represent that. So his little sister attends a wonderful school, and that's an earlier scene that Ruthie loves, but I can't read that scene tonight. And this is instead a scene of him being in the school where he attends, which is really a holding facility. It's the kind of school you have to walk through a metal detector. It's the kind of school where inspiration is not what's expected. And so all you need to know is he also comes into contact with his best friend, who I described already, a woman you've met throughout the book, and it was very important to me that there be strong women characters in this book around him, and that he also receives a letter from his best friend, brother man, who's been his friend since he was 5, who's currently incarcerated. So you'll weave in and out of different forms of his consciousness and be introduced to a few of his characters. As Warrior slowly walked from the train station to his school, he remembered how he had felt about school days when he was younger. He would wake every morning and choose a special outfit for the day, usually mixing bright colors that didn't match. He would dress quickly, eat breakfast, and run down the staircase of his Brooklyn brownstone. He would meet Brother Man at the foot of his stoop, and the two of them would run off to school, a whole new day of adventure in front of them. In those days, school was exciting and new. It was your job to play, and playing taught invaluable lessons for life. In those days, Warrior felt that he was learning something in school, but not anymore. Now school was monotonous. Warrior felt he was learning pointless information that he would never use, and it definitely was not fun. Now he learned his true lessons through the countless books he read, the discussions with his mother and father, the wisdom passed down from elders he knew, and the education that comes with living. His school didn't care enough to teach him. They seemed concerned only with order, rules, state tests, and statistics. Warrior walked up the many stone steps to the school and entered through the front doors. It was the middle of second period and the hallways were empty. He walked to his locker and opened the padlock. As he hung his coat on the hook, Warrior noticed the letter he had grabbed from the counter before leaving home sticking out of his coat pocket. He turned it over and saw that it was from Brother Man. Warrior quickly threw his books into his bag, shut his locker, and walked to one of the few quiet areas by the gym, below the offices, a place he went often to think. He sat down on the steps and opened the letter. A cold breeze from the large open window above him blew against his face. He was not the first to open the envelope. It had been unsealed already and read by the prison censors. It was marked with their stamp. The postmark showed that the censors' meddling had delayed the letter for over a week. Warrior unfolded the letter and entered Brother Man's world. Dear Warrior, my trial is coming and I'm starting to get nervous. I know they have no cause, but that means nothing. They might convince the jury that it's illegal in this state to assault the blue soldier's stick with a black skull. Or they might convince them that my teeth committed felonious assault against the soldier's gun. You never know. Nothing would surprise me anymore. They've already had me behind these bars for months now. The charge, getting my black ass beat. The law ain't nothing but our guillotine. I gotta get out of here soon, Warrior. There's too much ugliness in this place. You surround a man with ugliness like this for long enough, some of it's gonna rub off. A man can't drink and breathe pollution and remain clean. I'm surrounded by hatred and brutality, and I can feel the rage growing inside me. My blood is flowing with violence. I know that that is just what they want. They want me to strike out to give them cause, and I will not be their creation. They brutalize for the sake of brutalizing. I can see it in their eyes how much they enjoy pushing me to the edge. If I respond in kind, they win, and I'm not gonna have that. I'm trying to maintain to stay on the path, but they've turned it into a gauntlet, and it's hard not to stumble. I don't remember so many of the turns anymore. It's like I'm trying to find my way through darkness, and it's the darkness that breeds hatred. With the hatred comes violence. I know the way, but it's so tempting to turn into them. Remember the bears in the zoo, Warrior? Remember when we were little kids, it was our favorite place until we saw them that time? Then we didn't like it so much anymore. I keep seeing those bears. I keep hearing their cries. I gotta get out, Warrior. My head is constantly pounding. I hear the voices whispering. I can't spend the rest of my life in a cage. Love, Brother Man. Warrior finished the letter and sat on the cold, hard steps staring out the open window. He crumpled the envelope of the letter in his fist and threw it out the window, its weight fighting the force of the breeze. He gently folded the letter in half and then in half again, pressed down the edges firmly, and placed the letter in his shirt pocket. The bell for third period sounded, and Warrior reached up and grabbed the banister of the stairs, pulling himself up. He threw his bag across his shoulder and walked to English class. The classroom was bright and the radiators were furiously hissing as steam rose through the metal pipes. Warrior walked to the back of the room, acknowledging no one. He fell into a chair in the last row and immediately moved his eyes to the window. Some of his classmates gossiped, drew on their desks, or flirted with each other, while a few tried to make eye contact with Warrior. Their attempts rejected, the students simply added this to the latest rejection of many, engraving their image of warrior in stone. He did not care what image they carved. His mind was in distant places, and they were still busy being here and acting like children. Warrior listened to the shrill whistle of the radiator and felt the first beads of sweat trickle down his neck. The metal chairs of the classroom were too narrow for his broad back, and the sides of the chair dug into his shoulder blades. As he sat sweating, he looked out at the trees, their branches stripped bare by the wind. He heard somewhere the sound of the teacher's voice greeting the class and their mumbled replies of "Good morning." The teacher spoke, her voice calling off the names of students, and Warrior's eyes remained on the trees. "Warrior, is he here? Oh yes, there he is. Warrior, Warrior, are you with us?" The teacher's voice cut through Warrior's thoughts, and he turned his eyes towards her. "Here," Warrior replied through hardened eyes. "Please try to stay with us, Warrior. This is class time, you know." The teacher spoke while looking down from above her glasses. "Yeah, I know it's class time," replied Warrior as the teacher continued her roll call. Warrior shifted in the seat and began to sweat harder. As he listened to the radiator, its whistle far more interesting to him than the teacher's daily ritual, Warrior listened for a while until the teacher's voice broke through once more. "Now, what we're going to do today is to work on our writing using the autobiographical form. I want each of you to write a statement in the next 30 minutes that tells a little something about yourself. I want you to tell me who you are. Any questions?" Warrior laughed. "Yes, Warrior," the teacher said. "What seems to be the problem?" "Why do you think that I want to tell you anything about me? You really think I care if you know who I am? You can't handle who I am. We come from two completely different places, and you could never understand my world." Warrior stared at the teacher. "Well, why don't you try to tell me a little bit about your world? Try to make me understand this complicated place," the teacher said. "What about you? Are you going to tell us about who you are? You're going to show me a little bit of your world?" Warrior asked, his head tilted to the side. "I am not the student here, Warrior. You are. I have a choice. You do not. Answer the question," the teacher said, raising her voice. "You're asking for personal information. You're asking us to open up to you, to let you inside our minds, and I don't have enough time to show you that place. And then you won't even give us the respect of allowing us the same insight into yours? That seems..." Warrior's words were cut off by the teachers. "That's too bad now, isn't it? Now the question is, who are you? Answer the question however you may like. If you want to consider the exercise one of me looking into your mind, so be it. Just do it," the teacher said, taking off her glasses while she spoke. "Fine," Warrior said, "but you might not like what you see." He opened up his notebook and tore out a piece of paper. He wrote his name and the date in the upper left-hand corner and then stared down at the blank sheet. Drops of sweat fell onto the page. Warrior wiped the wetness from his forehead, but that only caused more drops to fall. As he sat there sweating, the words came. All of our souls contained rage. It is in our music, it's in our walk, it's in our blood. There are those who say, but some continue to smile. Our souls are made of many layers. Be assured, we wear masks and you do not see the rage in our eyes. I recently met an elder who asked me how old I was. Before I could answer, he said, 17. When I looked surprised, he said simply, "I can tell because your eyes are full of anger." Our eyes reflect our souls. You want to know who I am? Look beneath the mask. You want to know what I've seen? Look into my eyes. You want to know why I'm so loud? They tried to silence my voice since I came out screaming. When I was born, the white nurse handed me to my mother with the words, "Here's your screaming little Black Panther." So you want to know why I carry a chip on my shoulder, why I walk so strong and wear such a tightened jaw? You walk to live. I walk to survive. The names we wear tell stories of death. You ask me who I am? I tell you I don't know. I'm not supposed to survive. I'm supposed to die. You see, my brothers are disappearing. Countless numbers of them march in the army of the dead, and I do not want to walk with them. I avoid my destiny, and so I serve as a witness. If you were to go to our graveyard and ask all those with hearts filled with rage to scream, the sound emanating from beneath the ground would be deafening. Each day more voices scream. Each day more soldiers fall. Each day roll call lists another name. Each day another part of me dies. Who am I? I am 17. I am Black. I am barely alive. Warrior finished writing just as his hand began to cramp. He shook the cramp out, flinging more moisture on the page, making the ink run. He stood up suddenly from his seat, grabbed his bag, and walked to the teacher's desk at the front of the class. He thrust the page at her, turned his back, and walked out of the classroom. As he walked through the door, the teacher called to him, "Warrior, Warrior, there are 15 minutes left in this class. Warrior!" Her words faded away as Warrior walked into the hallway, the classroom door swinging shut behind him. The cool air brought relief from the sounds of the radiator and of the teacher's voice. Warrior walked to his locker, opened the steel door, and took out his jacket. He placed the 2 books he was reading in his bag, grabbed his hat, and shut the locker. He put on his jacket, zipped it up over his still sweating body, put one arm through his bag, and hat in hand, he walked down the hallway and out the school front door. As he walked down the steps, he saw her coming towards him. Her long legs were quickly covering the ground from the street to the school, desperate to get her out of the cold that she hated. Her wide, thick scarf wrapped around her head and neck, its length keeping her ears and face warm and her still wet hair unfrozen. From under the dark scarf, Warrior could see her ancient eyes. "Baby, you're going the wrong way. You're supposed to be going into school at this time, not out," she said as they met on the steps. Warrior just looked at her. She took his hand. "What's wrong?" She looked deep into his face. "What's wrong?" she said softly this time. Warrior slowly shook his head. "These people are fools, that's all. They stressing me. We sit in class every day, every year, listening to their story. What about ours? They spend all their time dismissing our experience, and then they got the nerve to ask me, 'Who are you?' We've survived things no other people have ever seen. And now they want to know how it is we done that surviving. They want to know the secrets. They take 15 minutes in one class to deal with me, and they think they can understand what I've seen in that little time. They think we're that simple." Warrior's jaw tightened as his words ended. She heard Warrior and responded, "English class, right? She asked you to tell her who you are." "Yeah, we had the same class yesterday. They are fools," she nodded. "She thinks I'm gonna tell her a damn thing about me, like I'm a damn experiment or something." Warrior spit in disgust. She shook her head and closed her eyes. "That's the most insulting part of it all, that in this place we will read one book about us, have a class about us, and that's supposed to equal 15 years of their story. There's more of us in this world than them, and our experience is taught as a supplement. Through one exercise, they think they can understand us, who we are and where we come from. We've had to learn for 15 years who they are. They don't understand what it's done to some of us, how it can get inside our minds." Her eyes remained closed as she stopped speaking. "And now that I've given her just a little taste of who I am, she'll probably tell me I'm filled with hate." Warrior rolled his eyes as he spoke. "So what does she call it when they've been giving us a little taste of who they are since we were 5 years old?" "I want to know what that's called," she said. "They call that education," Warrior said softly. They stood there, the wind blowing around them, her scarf waving in the air. They stood in silence. Words flowed between them that no one else could hear. They passed unsaid descriptions of what they felt, and with her touch and her attentive eyes, she tried to calm him. She knew she loved him, not in a light surface kind of way, but in the way adults always tell teenagers they can't love. She knew it like she knew her name. When he had finally, for the first time, come over to her house last year, she had giggled as he walked through the door, knowing the observations and judgment that was coming. Hers was a house of women, strong, independent, beautiful Caribbean women. 3 generations, including hers, hues of assorted color, all with high cheekbones, upright carriage, and a constant banter of jokes and comments that filled the air, sometimes biting, but always love. A mother who worked as a head nurse, survived all that came her way, had learned to expertly navigate a new and foreign land, always provided for her family, and saw everything as she judged quickly and permanently. An auntie who had become Rastafarian much to her own mother's disapproval, was an artist, seduced with a hug and an extra long beat of eye contact, and danced through life more than she walked. And a grandmother who lived in her daughter's home and was thankful for her place in it, approved of her daughter's career as a nurse and the manner in which she ran the home and raised her granddaughter, but disapproved that her daughter did this raising alone, and her choice in men, each and every one of them since her first. But she said little about this, except with her eyes, for her tone was just like her, about as gentle as stone. When Warrior had arrived at his friend's home, her mother was holding court while cooking a rich curry, potatoes peeking out, wooden spoon in her hand, permanently stained yellow from countless curries before this one, her hair curly and tied back. She had welcomed him, her daughters often discussed friend, with a warm hug and searching eyes. She seemed to notice and like his strength immediately, his quiet confidence as well. In the caring way she looked at him, she also seemed to notice his sadness. Her aunt immediately took his face in her hands and said his name with a Caribbean lilt, almost sang it, and then smiled and simply said, "Blessed." Her tiny grandmother looked up from her chair, her feet barely reaching the ottoman in front of her, peered over her glasses and said, "So, you're my granddaughter's friend." It was not a question. As the assorted watchers watched Warrior, his friend ate her afternoon snack of bun and cheese, and when Warrior looked for help, she had laughed out loud through bites, her eyes letting him know he was safe to a degree and entirely on his own. When he left, he realized they had decided his future. The cold was now cutting through their layers as they stood on those steps. He could feel that now she was thinking of his unique strength, but also how sad he was, even hopeless at times. He knew she was aware that he often woke up with rage. She looked scared, scared to hold him, scared not to. She took his hand. Warrior looked through her eyes and saw within her, saw how deeply she understood him. He knew she was also filled with pain, but he was uncomfortable that she seemed to be able to handle it so much better than he could. It didn't seem that it ever took her over, even for a minute. Her strength attracted him, scared him too. She always seemed at peace. He struggled to keep looking her in the eye. He saw how desperately she always tried to clear the rage from his thoughts, to ease the flow of his blood. She was always with him, reminding him to breathe. And when he had seen too much, her spirit would brush his face, gently claiming his eyes. He loved her for it, knew she could be like blood. Warrior knew this. He knew he should take her in his arms and let her ease the pain, but not today. Today was different. His eyes were his, and they had just begun to see. Thank you. Questions, comments, thoughts?
I really like your description of how he interprets like the community and how he views uh, like his history and like the history of like his people and like what they've gone through and the ignorance that he witnesses from his teachers and the people that just don't understand about Black culture and the community that he lives in.
Thank you. I appreciate it. There's a lot in the novel of kind of visitations also from his history. There are dreams, there are fantasies, there are things you'll have to interpret for yourself of exactly what they are, but he's visited by visions of times from slavery, from times of segregation, and he's visited by both the beauty and the horror that is the reality of African American, which I would say is American history in this country. It's a central part of the book, and trying to find the strength in that and not be consumed by the pain in that.
What was it like for you writing
I guess cathartic in a certain way. I mean, it felt like most of my writing has been essays, nonfiction essays, which feel very different. They feel it's more of a process to write it, and I kind of know the outcome of the point that I'm seeking to make. They've been op-ed length or longer essays in different kind of mediums. This certainly obviously felt much more artistic and creative. I wasn't always sure where all the characters were going. I had a wonderful writing teacher when I lived in Jamaica who was the first poet laureate of Jamaica, a guy named Mervyn Morris. And he always used to say to me, "Keep it clean." And I would always hear his words in my ear because I wanted to write a really tightly held novel. It's 7 chapters. It takes place over a winter period in New York City. It starts with a metaphorical death. It ends with a metaphorical birth. I wanted it connected in a very particular way, and there were times, Dan, where like I got interested in other characters and I wanted to go that route, but I had to pull it back. I wanted everything through his lens. So if you've read the novel, people don't have names. It's his mother, his father, his sister, in the same way that if you get up in the morning and have a bowl of cereal and there's your mom, you don't think about like her given name, you think about there's mom. So everything is through his perspective. That's part of why people aren't named. The other is, of course, the power of names. And so it felt very also exposing in a certain way. I write sometimes, written a series of op-eds about gun control, and people write all kind of ignorant things in the comments. It makes me laugh. It's like, we can have that debate anytime, or come through Harlem, we can have that conversation, and they don't usually show up. But, when it's much closer to your heart and it's a piece of art, that feels very, very different. And so that also is part of kind of putting a story out in the world that I felt much more connected to. So I think it felt both liberating, but also there are aspects of it that were nerve-wracking and scary about it too. Yes.
Going back to the passage you read, the ending felt I was battling between two feelings of like wanting him to stay with his friend, but also acknowledging that this is a very personal moment for him that he needed in order to move forward. So I'm wondering, in writing, at any point, did you feel like, did you also feel that torn between letting the character get the comfort that he needs, or letting him explore the world by himself?
Well, I appreciate that. It's wonderful comment. It's I wanted that tension. This is a novel that if it works well for the reader, I hope it kind of builds to a crescendo. It starts in a much more peaceful place, and it reaches a point where it's said that the drummer, the beat of the drum has gone mad. And so if you think about the power of drumming in many communities, but certainly in the, again, African American and African tradition, the drum keeps order and the drum keeps time. And so where that ends is that Warrior's reaching a point where he's going to start to really struggle with the voices. He's going to really start to struggle with the path. His very safety will be in danger. And so I want the reader to feel that fear. And yes, you want him to hold her and for her to hold him, and she wants to. But he's also struggling with two different things. What you're saying, the journey that he feels he's kind of on this path that he has to walk. But it's also, as he talks about a lot earlier in the novel, it's this mask that a lot of young black men feel they have to wear specifically. Then I think there's this broader issue of manhood and masculinity in our society. This idea of not feeling, right? I'm not going to be emotional. Of course, anger and rage are emotions, and those are acceptable feelings for men, and the deranged ideas we have around masculinity, but gentleness and softness may not be. And so he struggles with that. He's gentle and soft with his family and his sister and the woman he loves and everybody. But then he walks out and he has to wear this mask. And what does that do to him internally when he then has to come home and be loving to those he loves when he's wearing a mask out there? How easy can one take that mask off and on? He is terrified of violence and what that would mean to him. Again, that the guns can be pointed at him and that the violence in the community can be reaped on him. And yet he is seen as the threat everywhere he goes. And so that duality of being seen as the perpetrator of violence and the recipient of violence. And he struggles with it, also embracing that. I mean, the blue soldiers, as you heard mentioned, are of course the police, and using language of feeling that your community is being policed in that way produces a feeling of also wanting to respond in kind. Doesn't only produce fear. So in New York City at Brother and Sister So, we've worked very hard on this issue of fair policing. And there were 10 million stops during the Bloomberg years. This is a man who was going to run for president over how safe he made New York City. There were 10 million stops, almost all of black and brown men. Jon Stewart, when he was still on, made a joke that was funny, of course, and not funny, that there were more stops than there were black and brown men in the city, so they had to go to Mars and get some black and brown men and bring them to New York so they could be stopped and frisked. So every male at our organization was stopped and frisked 5 times, 10 times, 20 times. I was stopped 3 times and frisked at gunpoint. What does that experience produce? It produces rage and anger and defiance at these people who are trying to exert power over you for no other reason that they have a badge and a gun. And so under the law, you have to have a reasonable articulation of criminal activity to stop and frisk somebody. And of the 10 million stops, 96% of the people were innocent of any crime, no warrant, no possession, anything. 3.9%, they had an open container, warrant, something like that. 0.1%, they had a weapon. And that weapon includes a penknife all the way to a gun. So the stated reason was to get guns off the street, and then 99.9%, literally, and it sounds like I'm making it up, but trust me, you can do the research, this is what it is, that was not the case. And that's why a federal judge found it was unconstitutional. So that's a quick, tangent into the law, but what does that produce in terms of the everyday human psyche? What does it feel like one time to be put down on a dark street corner with a gun to the back of your head and frisked? What would that do to you? How long would you experience that trauma? And what does it mean if it happens 10 times or 20 times? And so he's living in revolt of that, and yet he's also terrified of the violence that's perpetrated potentially on him by people who look just like him. And he says at one point in the book, if I'm afraid of my own brothers, then I can't even look in the mirror. And so how does he deal with all that? It's a lot that we put on to young people. We put on to children, and then young men and young women. And so it's also trying to convey that, this constant internal struggle, warped ideas of manhood and masculinity, the intersection of race and violence and policing, and him just trying to be him, not wanting to have to always, be larger than himself. Other questions, responses, comments? Yeah.
So Royer, I think you did a pretty good job of describing him, and I think he really represents the black community, especially where I grew up. But one thing I did notice though, for his age of 17, he's very, very wise. I know me at that age, and a lot of my friends in school, we didn't notice that we were not being educated on the history of this country, especially pertaining to black people.
Mm-hmm.
So in your book, that's something that's very different.
So remember when he walks into the English class at first, he's talking about all the kids flirting with each other and knocking each other upside the head and being what young people should be, free, carefree, and silly, and how he's always felt different from them. And so one of the things I think is important is that they're all different types of 16, 17, 18-year-olds, right? Some are loosey-goosey, some are real depressed, some are, very wise, I think. And I've worked with plenty of very wise 17 and 18-year-olds. I certainly felt disconnected a lot from my peers in terms of what I was focused on mentally at that time. Told a story in the class earlier today, about Diane Nash, who was a leader of SNCC. A black woman, she was 19 years old, she was at Fisk University, she was one of the leaders of the Freedom Riders, and it's a story that always resonates with me, and I talk to young people a lot about it. And when they were about to begin one of their freedom rides, then Attorney General Bobby Kennedy's chief of staff called her and said, please don't get on those buses. We can't protect you, your life may be in danger. And she said, last night we wrote our last will and testament. So she was a 19-year-old young woman, some would call her a girl at the time still. She said that to essentially the Attorney General, which means she said it to the President of the United States, and she got on that bus. So I think it's important also that we push out stories of young people who are really serious thinking. We send 18-year-olds off to war, and then people act like they don't have anything to say. And so I think both are true. I think young people need to be carefree and not focused on, all of this necessarily. And yet I think it's really, really important that young people are. The other day I was going through some things at my grandmother's home, and I found a journal of my uncle, my father's brother, who was the leader of the civil rights movement in Eastern North Carolina, protests, folks on the street. This is a few years after the killing and lynching of Emmett Till. He went on to have an entire life dedicated to freedom and equality, fought against Vietnam, fought for gay and lesbian rights, and was one of the more prominent political black gay men in San Francisco before he passed away. And these are the notes of the civil rights movement he led. He was 16 years old. you know? So that's somewhat the family I come from, and that's here. But I think it's also that there are a lot of, you used a great word, there's a lot of wise young people out there, and we do well to listen to them.
Yeah. And also, just to clarify, I was not saying that like young people should be just like careless.
Oh, I didn't think you were. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just like saying like subconsciously, um, like we were just not taught about that. So as a result, you don't like think about that. So.
Yeah, we have a program in Brotherhood Sister Soul. It's called the Liberation Program. It teaches young people to be community organizers, work around fair policing, shutting down Rikers, environmental justice issues, and what good schools look like, essentially articulating that. And these are unbelievably fierce 9th to 12th graders who dedicate themselves to our Freedom School in the summer to learning about these issues and then to becoming activists. And a lot of them, to your point, sometimes get frustrated with their peers because they feel like their peers' eyes aren't open, that they're not listening, that they're not paying attention, especially in this time. What are you doing to push back against, you know, this vicious anti-woman, anti-black, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim agenda, anti-everything else coming out of the White House? So what are you doing about that? And these are fierce young people, and they feel the tension exactly that you're talking about, that a lot of their peers are not paying attention. And you know, we talk as staff that we don't always want it to be fire and brimstone, you know? Young people should be able to play video games or play ball or be silly and be children too. I mean, that's a negative of this, that if you grow up in these conditions, sometimes your childhood can be cut short in certain kind of ways. So there's a tension on both sides, you know? You want young people to be able to be free and carefree and also be wise, you know? Yes, and yes.
And I liked how you have the reality of public schools in urban communities and how they're underfunded and how they lack the information to provide quality education to young people of color, and how that's very relevant to today. I like the defunding of like public schools and how they're like losing programs and things like that, and then the building of like charter schools and how that affects the urban community. So I really liked your inclusion with that.
Thank you. You know, again, this is a novel, and so I didn't want to write a policy paper and start getting into all of my views on education. I got a lot of them. But just for context, in terms of what I'm trying to portray, New York City has 1.2 million children in the public school system, and 70,000 are graduating from high school. And we've had 2 successive mayors that people celebrate because the graduation rates are at 70%. To me, that's an unbelievably warped way of looking at our children. That means 400,000 kids won't graduate from high school, and we're celebrating that. So you can say that there have been some improvements over the last 15 years, but we shouldn't celebrate a 70% graduation rate. Of that 70%, Campaign for Fiscal Equity, it was the most far-reaching legal decision in America about education, the state of New York. People may be unfamiliar, there's no constitutional right to education on a national level. You have no right to an education. States have rights. And in the state of New York, you have a right to a common level education. That's the standard. And so the court case said that's not common, right? New York City school system is a caste system. Wonderful schools, good schools, mediocre schools, poor schools, and horrific schools. And your zip code determines which ones you go to unless you have parents who can navigate that process. And it's harder to get into a good public high school in New York City than it is to get into a good college. It's so absurd out there in terms of the process. And one of the most damaging findings of the Campaign for Fiscal Equity case was that a 12th grade diploma in low performing schools was an 8th grade level education. So even if you were there getting an 85 average, thinking you were doing well and you were prepared, you were sold a false bill of goods. You were getting an 8th grade level education, which means you can't compete in society. And so the last stat around it is that of those who graduate from high school, of the 70%, only 30% graduate without need of remedial support to go to a community college. So let's leave aside the 400,000 who aren't graduating and talk about the 70%. Of that group, 70% need remedial support to go to what is essentially 13th grade at BMCC or wherever. So that's an indictment of the entire system. And so I wanted to show that in his school. Again, there's his little sister's school, which is a beautiful place filled with wonderful teachers. And again, I love teachers, and that's not about indicting teachers, it's about indicting adults for allowing this to continue for our young people. I think you were, yep.
For me, I really appreciated this passage and this reading. like during winter break, I actually saw this book at Barnes and Noble, but the only reason I didn't get it was because I didn't have money.
Wait, hold on. You didn't get the book? Oh, you gotta go, man.
And I really connected with this passage because I'm from Brooklyn, New York, and I lived in Williamsburg
Yep.
when I was a child, when I immigrated to the United States, and then I moved to Brownsville.
Mm-hmm.
And I connected with not only this pressure on like masculinity and navigating to that as brown and black folks, but also like the educational system, because like all the schools that I went to didn't really have the resources to support black and brown children, especially being like bilingual as well. And also, I feel like navigating that at a young age, you kind of like internalize these stereotypes of how black men and black brown folks really are, and so we're not really seen as um, humane. And so for me, navigating through that as a child and as a teenager, for me it was difficult. And this passage that you just read, it speaks a lot about, and I really appreciated how you described this woman as strong. And for me, I've kind of like all my life admired my mother and see her as like a powerful figure in my life. And so even though everything is not perfect, like growing up in like in a patriarchal household, navigating through like masculinity, for me, this it says a lot about like just like our youth, because I feel like you said that this was a book mainly for, well, not mainly, but your target audience was the youth, mainly because more of them could relate to. And I feel like, to cut it off short, because I don't want to keep rambling up, I just feel like this, personally going into like these schools that didn't really have like funding to support us, that's when I started like going to searching for other schools, and that's when I found out like, about the charter school system. And the part where you described the sort of authority that the teacher had um, over the main character, and how sort of the question of who am I, like who are you?
Sure.
I feel like that's a question that I also struggle with, and I'm not really. It's hard to be vulnerable and hard to be open about stuff, because it's hard to like, oh, should I just be vulnerable and tell you all my struggles and tell you all about me? And so that's something that I really, the authenticity within that passage, and how like woman, how he sees his family members as strong, like empowering women. I feel like that's what something that has really stood out for me.
I appreciate that. You said a lot, so you didn't ramble. You said a lot. Just a few kind of responses to what you're talking about. So a core aspect of the work at Brotherhood Sister Soul is to define, young people to define what it means to be men and women, leaders, brothers and sisters in their community, to collectively come up with these definitions. And then after a later period in the oath of dedications, in the rites of passage process, to write a personal oath of dedication. This is something most adults have never done in their life. What do you believe in? What's your moral and ethical code? How are you going to live your life? This is going to be a governing document for your life. We didn't invent this, lots of religions and ethnicities do it, but what we're saying is it's important for everybody to take this kind of step in their life. And who are you is a central question that we ask. And it's so interesting that you use that language. And so again, I didn't go into a diatribe about education in the novel, but instead tried to speak to the difficulty he faces versus what learning can be. He comes from a family that loves learning. His mom's a school teacher. His father is a musician, but the keeper of family history. And I also wanted her to be kind of more the day-to-day wage earner, and him to be the artistic person, to play a little bit with some of these ideas of manhood and womanhood and masculinity and femininity. And so that's a central part of our work. Who are you? What do you believe in? That's obviously more the Freirean model than, you know, the talking down at students. And so just trying to capture some of that. And I think the pain that so many students feel of being told what to do all the time in this very didactic way. You mentioned the manhood and masculinity piece. Again, you know, you can look at these issues intra or external. There's a very unique experience in this country, you know, and there are lots of unique experiences, but there's a very unique experience in this country about the desire to control, to police the black male body. It extends in lots of different spaces. Much of the slave law was written in that way. So different approaches to the black woman body, which was seen to produce offspring and to produce property. The greatest value in this country was black-owned human beings. That's what literally the wealth of the country was based on. Insurance companies based their insurance plans on human-owned capital. Wall Street investing in human bodies, right? But there was a separate part of the law written to control the black male body. And that's what a lot of slave laws were built in place to do, to restrict movement, to restrict the ability to read, to restrict the ability to pass on property, to restrict the ability to have whatever the role would be of the father in the family. And all policing in this country, again, everyone can go research this legally if you question it. I swear to you it's the truth, but I believe in everybody doing their own research. All police forces are based on initial patrols that were built to control enslaved people. The slave patrols were the father and mother figures of common policing. That's all the laws that were written in terms of what were anti-vagrant laws, in terms of what were controlling citizens, were all based, again, on policing of enslaved people and the property. There was a famous law called the Fugitive Slave Act. And so if you fled from slavery and you made it to the north up here, the person who owned you in the South could send up slave catchers to come grab you in Boston or grab you in Maine or whatever. And the law was written so that you could not testify against the person coming to catch you. No black person could testify against a white person in court. So it was his word against no word. And this is what 13 Years a Slave is about, because while he grabbed you, who really was enslaved, he could grab your best friend as well and take both of you back. And Frederick Douglass said the only way to make the Fugitive Slave Act a dead act is to make some dead slave catchers, right? The entire system was built that way. One other case, the Dred Scott case, it's a black male who goes to the Supreme Court and says he's been in free land, even though he had previously been enslaved. I'm truncating it greatly so we don't go on to a long thing about the law. And that was his argument. And the United States Supreme Court said, you cannot bring this case. It would be like a donkey or a cow or a pig bringing this case. You are property and owned. And the famous line from the Supreme Court, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Taney, was, the black man has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. This is the Supreme Court of the United States. So these laws were all put in place about controlling the black body that continue today. And so it's important to see that historical reference when you're talking about how police seek to continue to control bodies or how the criminal justice system does. The third, last piece on it is that you mentioned the issue of kind of broader manhood and masculinity. And so when you're talking about you struggling, and we all struggle, whether people admit it or not, we all struggle with these warped ideas of manhood and masculinity. How do you respond to that history and want to be defiant and want to be aggressive and want to push back on it, but also, again, want to be gentle and want to be soft? And that is not a black reality. The majority of violence in this country is committed by white men. Majority of rape and murder is committed by white men, even if you have disproportionate numbers in other communities. We had yet another horrific shooting 3 weeks ago. Overwhelmingly, mass shootings are done by white men, but there have been Latin men and black men and Asian men and all kind of men who have done those shootings, right? From Fort Hood to Virginia Tech. You can bet your life every time you hear there's a mass shooting, though, there's going to be a man who did it. So when people say there's a problem with guns and mental health, guns are easily accessible to women, and women struggle with mental health, so how come they don't ever shoot anybody up? Because the third part of that is this warped idea of manhood and masculinity, of men of all backgrounds thinking that violence is the answer. And so how do you struggle with that? And how do you struggle with sometimes a righteous violence? And that's why I'm mentioning the history of kind of slavery and segregation, that it's righteous to push back against that, and if need be, violently, with also that not consuming you. and in losing your sense of identity in this warped idea of violence and manhood.
Then my follow-up question would be, talking about these heavy topics, what was your process in writing? Because for me, writing about these topics, it takes me a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And like I'm taking this course about writing about home and what home means to me. And one of the pieces were a personal statement. And I talked a lot about masculinity, but it was, and I also used the symbol of us men masking ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But what was your process like? Because I feel like when writing, it becomes difficult trying to write and like be vulnerable, especially when you're writing like a personal
Sure.
or fictional piece.
I think that's a struggle all artists feel with their art form, to be vulnerable, to be honest. You got to tell your story. You got to not tell a story for anybody else. I think your story has to be true to you. Toni Morrison has a great line. She wrote her first book because it was a book she had never read and she wanted to write it. You know, I think you got to write your truth and try to constantly push back on what people expect of you. And I think people of all genders and sexual orientations and races and ethnicities deal with that. So I think you just have to you have to write your truth and you have to push back. And I think vulnerability and art really go hand in hand. I don't think you can be a great artist without being vulnerable in certain ways. And so there's a lot of pain in this novel. There's also, hopefully, you would think, a lot of beauty and wonderful moments and sweet moments, that it's balanced. This is not just like open it up and, go into the depths, you know what I mean? That's not what it is. But it's trying to speak to these two different parts, the vulnerability of the character, and I think, again, it's a great word, but also the strength of the character. He's both things. And, I think that goes, again, to the core of the teaching of Brotherhood, Sister, Soul, is that you can be deeply vulnerable and deeply strong. And again, we have this concept in America of manhood and masculinity, that cuts to the core. It's not about race. I mean, that's John Wayne to the superheroes, right? It's that you can defeat anything. That's a very American phenomenon. And as much as there's violence in the hood, I don't know what's more violent than George Bush, going to war and 500,000 people dying over somebody threatening his father, which is really what that was at the end of the day, or the violence we see coming out of this White House. That's all violence, So who defines what violence is and what it isn't, Eveline.
Myself, I just want to say thank you on so many levels for all you've ever done to support young people being validated.
Thank you.
Brotherhood to Soul, 20 plus years doing this work. I really appreciate you. I
Thank you.
appreciate you being a model for us to get our stories told, to be literature, and for us to be able to use it, continue to use with other young people to inspire them to write their stories. I love you, and I appreciate you so much that I have a 12-year-old now that can read this and be balanced and understand that it's a wild, wild world, but that his feelings are valid and that he can find his way. Because when we were growing up, we didn't have these books. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. In addition to being a dear friend, Eveline worked with us at Brosis for many years and is a wonderful youth worker and artist and voice in her own right. So thank you very much for that, Eveline.
Khary, can you talk a little bit about Brotherhood, Sister, Soul?
No. So Brotherhood, Sister, Soul is, there's a lot of ways to describe it. It's a formed community. It's a group of adults and young people who've committed themselves to live in a more righteous and conscious way. It's connected by our themes of positivity, knowledge, community, and future, that you'll agree to live according to those ideals. Our theory of change is to provide support, guidance, love, and education to young people, to teach them to form discipline and order in their life, and then to provide opportunities and access so they can develop agency. So love, support, guidance, and education, all the things that a family would want to provide for a child. And sometimes we're augmenting a wonderful family, and sometimes we're the most stable adults in that child's life. It really depends. And that's really important to say. There's some wonderful parents who send their kids to us, and they're wonderful parents in the hood, and then there are some kids who don't have any support at home. So support, guidance, love, and education. Teach them to form discipline and order, and then opportunities and access so they can develop agency. They can do things in their own right. What does that look like? That looks like the most comprehensive youth development you can imagine. From 8 to 18, really for life. They still come back. It's about defining a moral and ethical code. It's arts-based education. It's environmental education. We run a farmer's market and youth run and bring 30,000 pounds of food to 2,000 community residents. It's training young people to be community organizers. It's college guidance, workforce development. It's mental health support when they need it and legal representation when they need it. If you come after our young people, we'll be there to protect them no matter what. We want it just like a middle-class child. Middle-class child messes up all the time. They get support of their family, so will our children. And so every aspect of support, and it comes from really dedicated youth workers who dedicate their lives to guiding these young people as, ministers, preachers, reverends, moms, dads, sisters, brothers, behind kickers every now and then, coaches, therapists, shoulders, really guiding the young people and supporting them, but supporting them in a way that's communal and that's sharing. Our staff, we ask a lot of them. They have to come in and share their own stories. They have to be honest with their own experiences. When a group of young people are talking about sexual assault and that they've experienced it, our staff talk about their own experiences, right? There's no way to help young people in that space if you're not present and honest and real. And so it's really comprehensive and deep support of young people. Then we've published 5 books of curricula, and we've trained educators across the country on the model and helped schools and CBOs to implement some aspects of the model. We don't franchise it. It's not like this Brother and Sister Soul in Chicago, but we can help you to do better writing and arts-based work with the young people or help you to form the Rites of Passage program. And we've trained about, coming up on 3,000 educators from 200 organizations around the country. We've done formal programming in Brazil and Bermuda, so we've also done it internationally. And then the third leg of the stool is that we work to try to change the conditions so that our young people don't have to keep experiencing them. So we work on social justice policy from within. There are interesting partners in this work sometimes. We work to decriminalize marijuana, which disproportionately affects black and brown kids. I've heard there's a lot of marijuana smoked on this campus. Somebody told me that once. But the police don't raid here and arrest kids. Kids get arrested in our neighborhood for smoking marijuana. People like to laugh about it when they run for president, about whether they inhaled or not. It's not a laughing matter. You get arrested for misdemeanor marijuana usage in New York City, your family can lose public housing, kicked out of the housing project because you used marijuana. Can't get a job as a barber. If you have a conviction for selling marijuana, you can't get financial aid. If you rape somebody, you can. Our legal policy is so twisted around this issue. You have 13, 15 states, big business is marijuana, and they're still arresting poor black and brown kids for marijuana. So we try to change issues like that. We try to shut down Rikers Island. Rikers Island is the 2nd largest jail in America. 10,000 people are on it. The former U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara found that torture exists on the island every single night. Children are being tortured. The great liberal state of New York is one of the 2 states in America that prosecutes children as adults. We're trying to change those kind of conditions as well so that our young people don't have to face those conditions. There's an old story or adage that I love to tell, which I think tries to capture that, which is that there's a group of elders, adults, on the side of a river, and they're swimming and playing and hanging out, and all of a sudden a baby comes floating down the river, and they are wondering what's going on. They jump in, and the baby's almost drowned, and they pull the baby out, do CPR, bring the baby back, and just as kind of calmed down, they see a second baby coming down, and again they jump in and they grab the child and they pull the child out and start doing CPR, and at that point a woman runs up the side of the banks, and they kind of scream at her angrily, "Where are you going? We just pulled a child out who's almost drowning." And she said, "I'm running up the banks to find out who the hell's throwing our kids in the water." And so we want to speak to the fundamental issues of inequality and equity our kids face. We want to provide the services so they can overcome them, the individual children, and then we want to work to articulate why these conditions are so unfair. Even we know, we can't change but a drop of the water, but we want to do everything we can to change them and to articulate a different way. And we think that's central to the work. And we think that the work merges those 2 pieces. We think political education of young people is what does both of those things. If if all of us are a group of young people and we're all politically educated to really understand what's going on in this world, we can transform our lives. And if we're all politically educated, then we can go out and work to transform the system. And so that's the core piece of what we do.
I have to add some.
Okay.
I had an amazing time reading your book, and
Thank you.
I appreciate the journey you led me through, and especially like looking at like the tension you were talking about in the beginning that was being felt, and I read this book like in between classes in the bus, literally everywhere at all time, and this tension was building on me throughout the whole time I was reading the book. And I really wanted to finish it so I could let go of that tension, but at the same time, I never wanted it to end because it felt so real. So I really appreciate it, and I thank you. And I think one of my favorite characters is Weatherman because I love the duality of his character. And like in the beginning, Daniel was talking about how when you would see, as a younger kid, when you would see homeless people on the street and they kind of became part of the background. I really appreciate how you took Waterman outside of the background. He was part of the community as much as Warrior was part of the community, so I really appreciate that. So I was hoping you could sign my book.
Sure. Well, that's very beautiful. I appreciate your words, and thank you everybody very much for this evening. Thank you for coming out, and we'll stop on that note because those are great words to stop on. All right. Thank you. What's your name?
Veronica.
Veronica.